Hello and welcome to the Legend of Chess 2020 tournament, and it's round 5 and the big match is coming up where Magnus Carlsen is taking on Vasily Ivanchuk. And let's have a look at game 1 where Carlsen is playing with the white pieces and Ivanchuk is playing with the black pieces. So playing with the white pieces, Carlsen opens with d4 and knight to f6 replies Ivanchuk, and c4 and e6, knight f3 and bishop to b4. Ivanchuk goes for the Bogo Indian defense, bishop to b4 check. So Carlsen plays knight b to d2. Normally a bishop to d2 is played. Ivanchuk goes for castling, and now a3 attacking the bishop. Now bishop goes to e7 and now e4 controlling the center, and d6. Now bishop to e2 and knight f to d7. So now knight to b1, preparing to play knight to c3. So d5 by Ivanchuk. So then knight to c3 and d takes e4 and knight takes e4. Now knight to f6. Now queen comes in rescue, queen supports the e4 knight. So now knight b to d7 and knight g5. It's a wonderful move by Carlsen, because now the black knight on f6 cannot move, and if the knight moves then the threat of queen into h7 check is there. So after knight e to g5, Ivanchuk plays c5. Now bishop to e3 supporting the d4 pawn. So Ivanchuk plays queen to a5 with a check. So Carlsen decides to play king to f1. He's not at all bothered about castling. So after that, queen to c7. Now rook to d1, preparing to open up the d file and launch an attack. So in reply to rook to d1, Ivanchuk plays b6 supporting the c5 pawn. Here Carlsen plays knight to e5. Here Carlsen is sacrificing a piece, a pawn. So knight takes e5 and d takes e5 and queen takes e5, queen into e5. Now bishop to f, attacking the rook on a8. So now rook to b8 and h4. Carlsen is trying to promote the pawn. So now queen to c7 and then rook to h3. Carlsen is trying to play rook to g3 and then later on launch an attack. So in reply to rook to h3, Ivanchuk plays bishop to b7 and now rook to e1 and rook b to d8. Here Ivanchuk gets a open rook file. Now Carlsen decides to trade the light squared bishops with bishop into b7 and now queen into b7 and bishop to d2 and h6 attacking the knight. But here Carlsen plays bishop to c3. He's not at all bothered about h into g5. So in reply, Ivanchuk plays rook f to e8, because h into g5 and h into g5, after the knight moves from f6, then this is checkmate. So after rook f to e8, Carlsen plays king to g1 and rook to d7 and knight to f3, bishop to d6 and knight to e5, attacking the rook on d7. So now Ivanchuk takes the knight, bishop into e5 and bishop into e5. So now rook e to d8. Here Ivanchuk is planning to attack the queen by playing rook to d2, doubling of rooks. So here Carlsen plays bishop to c3, coming in rescue. So here Ivanchuk cannot play rook to d2. So now queen to c7 and queen to c1. Now knight to e4. Ivanchuk is planning to take the dangerous bishop on c3. Here the bishop is posing a real threat on the king side. So Ivanchuk decide to eliminate the bishop. So now rook to f3, and Ivanchuk takes the bishop on c3, knight into c3 and queen into c3. Now rook to d4, attacking the pawn on h4. So now g3 supports the pawn, g3 supports the pawn, and rook 8 to d7 and b3. Now queen comes to c6 and rook f to e3, and now a5 controlling and the b4 square. Now a4 and to control the b5 square. So now queen to d6, consolidating the position. So queen comes to c2 and queen to c6. Now queen to e2. Here also Carlsen is also trying to attack. So now rook 7 to d6 and queen to h5. So queen to d7 and queen to f3. Now queen d8 and king to h2, and now rook to d2 and rook 1 to e2. Now rook takes the rook into e2 and queen into e2. So now rook to d2, attacking the queen. So now queen plays e1 and h5. Now rook f3 and g6. Now queen to e4. Now rook to d4, attacking the queen. So now queen goes to b7, is targeting the f7 pawn with a check. So now rook to d7 and queen plays c6. Now king to g7 and king to g2. Rook to d6, attacking the queen. Now queen plays b7 and queen to d7. Here Ivanchuk is offering a trade of queens, but Carlsen here decides to play queen to e4. Carlsen is not interested in trading of queens at the moment. So after queen to e4, Ivanchuk plays f6 and rook to e3. Rook to e3 and e5, king to h2 and rook to d2, attacking the f2 pawn. So here rook to e2 and rook to d4, again attacking the queen. So now queen plays 8 and rook to d3, attacking the pawn on b3. So here Carlsen plays rook to b2, supporting the pawn, and f5. Now queen to b8, attacking the pawn on e5. So here queen to d6, supporting the pawn, and now queen to b7, check. So now king goes to h6 and queen to c8. Now queen to f6, queen c7 and f4. So instead of f4, if Ivanchuk played g5, then h into g5 and queen into g5 and queen into e5, Ivanchuk will lose a pawn. So in reply, so here Ivanchuk plays f4. So in reply, Carlsen plays rook to e2, attacking the pawn on e5. So f into g4 check and f into g3 check and f into g3 and e4. Here if Carlsen takes the pawn on e4, then queen to f2 is check, and Carlsen will further lose the game. So he didn't take the pawn on e4. So in reply to e4, Carlsen plays queen to b8, and Ivanchuk ultimately takes the pawn on b3, rook into b3, and queen to e8, attacking the pawn. So now e3. So in reply to e3, Carlsen didn't take the pawn, because if rook into e3, then queen. So in reply to e3, Carlsen plays king to g2. So now rook to c3, attacking the pawn on c4. Now rook takes e3 and rook takes c4, rook into c4, and rook to f3, attacking the queen. So now queen goes to g7 and queen to e3 check. But here instead of queen to e3, it was better to play rook to f7. Carlsen could have won the game easily after that, but here Carlsen somehow decided to play queen to e3 check. So now king to h7 and queen to e6, attacking the rook. At the same time, he's trying to play rook to f7 and pin. Now rook to c2 check, and king goes to h3 and king h6 and queen to e3 check. So king goes to h7 and queen to e8, and king again goes to h6 to prevent white from playing rook to f7 to pin. So now queen e3 again, queen e3 check, and now king to h7. So to avoid repetition, Magnus plays a blunder here, queen to b3. Queen to b3 was a blunder, and that cost Carlsen the game. Carlsen was trying to take the rook. Carlsen was trying to attack the rook on c2, but that was a costly mistake, because what Ivanchuk played here was queen to d7 check and mate, because Carlsen's king cannot move anywhere. Even if g4, then queen into g4 is checkmate. So it was a wonderful game played by Ivanchuk. So hope you all enjoyed.